Hello and welcome to the Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination. My name is Melissa Bell. I'm CNN's correspondent here in Paris and really delighted to be with you today to act as master of ceremony for what is not only an extremely important forum in terms of its content, but a landmark one as well for UNESCO. First of all, a couple of technical points before we actually get started with today's main discussions. First of all, the languages. This is a global conversation, and you can therefore not only follow, but also take part in 6 different languages. If you look at the bottom of your screen, English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian are all available, and really we'd encourage you to get to the language that you feel most comfortable in, because the idea is that you will also be able to take part in this discussion. The idea, of course, is to come up with ideas together today. Another technical point, you'll have noticed that we're in this vast, wonderful auditorium here at UNESCO in the very heart of Paris. Very few of us actually in the building because of COVID-19 restrictions. The idea is that this conversation would be held, this forum would go ahead, but of course with all the necessary social distancing restrictions well respected in order that the conversation can happen whilst we all remain safe. Now, first of all, a little bit of context just before we get started. This forum is being held as a celebration of the International Day for the Eradication of Racial Discrimination, but it is also a landmark event, as I was saying a moment ago, because it is the first time that UNESCO have hosted an international gathering since that adoption back in December of the Global Call Against Racism. Now, that was spearheaded by the Republic of Korea, which is why this is a forum that is being co-hosted by UNESCO and the Republic of Korea, and we're really glad that everyone's been able to come together in order that it can be held. Now, first of all, those questions that led to that global call being adopted by member states back in December were urgent and timely then, and of course they've become even more so with the events of the last few weeks, and I'm thinking here, of course, of the tragedy in Atlanta, which serves, I think, as a reminder that we're not just talking about right and wrong here, we're also literally talking about matters of life and death. The idea behind this meeting was that the social and human sciences sector of UNESCO and the Republic of Korea really wanted to be able to have a conversation in order that ideas could be contributed, that a roadmap be found, in order that concrete action can be taken, in order that these historical issues of racism and discrimination can once and for all be put behind us. There will be 4 panels. The idea was to bring together as many stakeholders as we could, so you're going to hear from member states, members of civil society, NGOs, the media, private sector as well, foundations, all coming together in these 4 different discussions, 4 different panels to try and look at some of those ideas. And again, please contribute any thoughts that you have, any reactions you may have to what you're going to hear today. This is an interactive forum, and you can use the hashtag on social media, fulfill the dream, and hashtag fight racism as well in order to be part of that. Some welcoming words, first of all, from the Director General of UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, c'est un grand plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à ce Forum mondial contre le racisme et la discrimination. Ce forum est d'abord une réponse directe à l'appel mondial contre le racisme et les discriminations qui a été lancé ici en décembre dernier à l'initiative de la République de Corée par 41 États membres de l'UNESCO. 4 mois plus tard, nous voici de nouveau réunis, une nouvelle fois avec le soutien de la République de Corée, que je voudrais remercier ici très chaleureusement, afin de travailler ensemble à établir une feuille de route et transformer cet appel à la mobilisation en action. C'est le signe qu'en cette période difficile, très propice, nous l'avons vu, à la résurgence du racisme, des discriminations, qu'il existe une conviction ferme et partagée que nous devons être tous unis contre le racisme. C'est le message fondamental de la campagne que nous avons lancée en août dernier, portée par des personnalités comme Freda Pinto, Herbie Hancock, Forest Whitaker ou encore Nadia Nadim. S'unir dans ce combat est essentiel, car le racisme met en péril ce qui est au fondement même de notre société, la capacité à vivre ensemble. Le racisme puise ses forces dans nos préjugés, dans nos peurs, ces peurs qui se sont accrues pendant la pandémie, mais s'ancre aussi dans le passé et dans les passés les plus violents et les heures les plus sombres de notre histoire. Revendiqués par des groupes populistes, xénophobes, haineux, les discours racistes sont amplifiés par les stéréotypes et la désinformation qui malheureusement prolifèrent sur les réseaux sociaux. Un tel poison, aussi insidieux, aussi ramifié, aussi prompt à ressurgir, comme nous l'avons vu ces derniers mois, nécessite plus que jamais que nous nous engagions collectivement. Comme le racisme est contagieux lui aussi et se transmet d'un être humain à l'autre, pour reprendre les mots de Dany Laferrière, il n'y a pas de guérison possible sans un effort collectif. Et vous le savez, c'est toute l'histoire de l'UNESCO, toute son ADN, que de s'engager contre le racisme et d'élever dans les consciences les barrières les plus sûres pour lutter contre le racisme. Nous agissons de multiples manières et principalement dans deux directions, l'éducation et la connaissance. L'éducation tout d'abord, car connaître et respecter l'autre dans sa dignité, désamorcer les mécanismes de haine, devenir un citoyen éclairé du monde, cela s'apprend. C'est le sens de tout notre travail sur la prévention des discriminations et du racisme par l'éducation, le sens de notre travail sur l'éducation aux médias et à l'information, parce que ça aussi, cela s'apprend. C'est le sens aussi de nos masterclass spécifiques que nous avons particulièrement développés ces derniers temps pour pouvoir adopter un regard critique face à ces discours de haine qui prolifèrent. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we also take action through the social and human sciences, the second focus of our work after education. In collaboration with universities, with academic communities, UNESCO chairs, we seek to understand better the effects and origins of discrimination, interaction between individuals and the structures of society. Our Slave Root project, for example, improves understanding of the slave trade and slavery and contributes to reflections on contemporary inequalities through its comprehensive approach to history and memory. Even more crucially, the social and human sciences allow us to develop more relevant, appropriate public policies like those being tested daily in our inclusive and sustainable cities and shape a brighter future through this network. By inspiring critical reflection, these disciplines help raise awareness and allow us to fight even the most insidious forms of racism, like, for instance, the biases that sometimes infiltrate artificial intelligence algorithms, which is also at the core of our work for a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we do know the path we must take. Now we must take action together to fight, deconstruct racism, to develop anti-racist policies, to fight stereotypes, to foster diversity. And these issues shape our discussions today. And I thank all the government representatives, all the prominent personalities, all the civil society actors who have gathered today to stand at UNESCO's side. Together, we can build a mutual respect and understanding that will help us create a truly shared world. I thank you and wish you excellent discussions.
Thank you very much to Director General Audrey Azoulay there for those words which should serve as sort of guide to us throughout the day. These ideas that we're discussing today, this fight against racism and discrimination, I think as we were just hearing, no one had imagined that the ideas that we had assumed to be universal and things we would be building on would be contested today. On the upside, there is of course a growing sense worldwide that these urgent issues need to be discussed. Voices are raising themselves all over the world. I'm thinking not only of the vigils we've seen in the United States around Atlanta and other American cities these last few days, but of course the Black Lives Matter movement of last year, movements here in Europe as well these last few years with regard to history and its importance in our understanding of racism and discrimination today. I'd like you to have a listen now to some of those voices who are joining UNESCO in today's call.
Many of us like to think of racism as something from the past, something that no longer holds sway over our societies, something that no longer exists.
But World War II took place less than a century ago. Survivors of the Holocaust are still alive today.
The Jim Crow laws were enforced until 1965.
L'apartheid a été une réalité jusqu'en 1991.
We live in a world where people face barriers to education, employment, health, justice, and culture just because of the color of their skin.
Where people are discriminated against, excluded, stigmatized, attacked, or even murdered.
Just because of where they come from, what they look like, or what they believe in.
No more.
No more.
No more.
Hoy decimos basta.
El racismo y la discriminación son causados por la ignorancia y el miedo a lo que creemos diferente.
ويخترقان هياكلنا الإدارية وثقافتنا الشعبية وتحيزنا وفرضياتنا اللاواعية.
But this doesn't have to be the case.
You, me, us, we can create the change that we want.
By defending quality education for all, we can combat the root causes of deadly stereotypes and prejudices.
By developing historical knowledge and critical thinking, we can improve our understanding of the past.
By encouraging cultural diversity, especially at the local level, we can build societies that are more respectful of others.
By empowering the younger generation,
we can help them shape the world to come.
So, stop watching from the sideline.
Read, observe, learn, and listen.
We must hold ourselves accountable.
We must hold our societies accountable.
We are all one humanity.
Keep quiet is not an option.
Is not an option.
Di lo que piensas.
Speak up.
Speak up. Take action.
Take action.
Take action.
Thank you to all of those who took part in that. Just some of the voices uniting around today's theme, the idea then to speak up and to take action. And that's what today is going to be all about, trying to come up with concrete steps that can now be taken, at last be taken, in order that this is put behind us once and for all. Now, UNESCO has been leading the fight against racism and discrimination since its creation in 1945. But as Gabriela Ramos and I were just discussing, and I will introduce you to her in just a moment, it is about always beefing up really what can be done and trying to stay up to date with what experts are saying, with what's happening from the ground, and hence this important meeting, the first of its kind today held by UNESCO, but one of many more to come, we hope. We're going, as I was saying a moment ago, first of all, this was born of that global call against racism that was adopted by member states back in December. That effort was spearheaded by the Republic of Korea, which is why it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Cho Jong-mun, who is the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, and who's going to deliver today's opening remarks.
UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet, OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria, Goodwill Ambassador Forrest Whitaker, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and colleagues. On behalf of the Republic of Korea, it is my honor and pleasure to co-host the Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination with UNESCO as we celebrate the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Given the recent upsurge of racial discrimination, indeed, this is a time to reaffirm our commitment to counter all forms of discrimination with a renewed sense of determination. In this regard, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Director General Azoulay for providing a timely occasion to reflect on this issue and to identify the way forward. Excellencies and distinguished guests, the COVID-19 pandemic has painfully reminded us of how easily we can fall victim to disinformation, suspicion, and ignorance that breed discrimination. As the virus spreads around the globe, there have been reports of incidents involving hate speech, stigmatization, and even violence against certain racial and ethnic groups. Such inhuman behaviors not only undermine the fundamental tenets of human rights, but damage international cooperation by weakening the mutual trust necessary to respond effectively to the crisis. As clearly stated in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the elimination of racism and discrimination is a pressing task for us to tackle. While the virus harms the body, discrimination harms the mind. Just as we need a vaccine to protect against the disease, we need education to fight against prejudice and hatred. In the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, UNESCO's mission has assumed even greater meaning. Global Citizenship Education, or GCED, as a strategic area of UNESCO's education, aims to empower people to assume active roles both at the local and global level in building more peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable societies. The value of GCED lies precisely in its power to promote universal values such as humanism, tolerance, and respect for diversity. It is against this backdrop that the Korean government launched, together with other like-minded countries, the Group of Friends for Solidarity and Inclusion with Global Citizenship Education in UNESCO last May. Excellencies, distinguished guests, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 1 clearly articulates that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That is, no one should hurt a person's dignity and right to be free and equal. Racism and discrimination are a clear challenge, and it is a challenge which requires an immediate response. To this end, there is a need more than ever for international cooperation and the support of multilateral institutions, including UNESCO. The Korean government has every confidence that UNESCO, with its convening power and extensive global networks, will truly play a meaningful role in traveling this long and difficult journey of combating racism and discrimination. I look forward to seeing tangible results, which can provide us with valuable guidance in developing a roadmap during today's forum. I'd like to close my remarks by reiterating that our efforts to foster a yet deeper shared sense of humanity and solidarity around the world will ultimately lead to meaningful change. Thank you.
His Excellency Choi Jung-won there with the opening remarks. Thank you very much. An important reminder there of what we're talking about today, human rights, the idea of universal human rights that are, of course, at the very heart of all of our international infrastructure, not just organizations like UNESCO, the United Nations, but everything that's been built since 1945 to try and make the world a more peaceful place, which is why I'm delighted to introduce now a woman who is at the forefront of that, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who's going to deliver our keynote address today.
I am pleased to join you in opening this global forum against racism and discrimination. Racism violates everything we stand for and everything we do. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed just how pervasive this threat is and how deeply rooted are discrimination-fueled inequalities in our societies. The disproportionate health impact and massive loss of lives of people of African descent, ethnic minorities, and other marginalized and disadvantaged groups during the pandemic were powered by decades of unequal healthcare and inadequate living conditions. The overwhelming economic and social burdens they are suffering reflect systemic obstacles in access to education, employment, and other opportunities. Generation upon generation of deprivation, discrimination, and injustice shaped the fractures that the pandemic revealed, exploited, and amplified. Fractures that each and every one of us have a responsibility to help mend. And for that, we must spare no effort to eliminate racial discrimination. Indeed, I would say discrimination is at the core of a great many, if not all, human rights violations. So it is clear to me that addressing the challenge of racial discrimination and the social and economic inequality founded in it is a very important way to recover better from this crisis. to recover into societies that are truly and sustainably more equal, resilient, and just. I welcome this global forum as a multi-stakeholder response to the recent upsurge in racial discrimination everywhere, as well as its goal to produce a global call against racism. In this effort, it will be important that civil society from all regions have the opportunity to participate. Moreover, all stakeholders should support and create the civic space for young people to connect, contribute, and reach out to their peers around the world. And I welcome UNESCO's global efforts against racism and look forward to continuing our long-standing collaboration on issues of human rights, racial discrimination, and discrimination of any kind. Education is also key to our efforts. In collaboration with UNESCO, academic institutions, and civil society organizations, my office has been carrying out research on the historical legacy of enslavement and on the contributions of people of African descent to society. We have also worked on a blog about the cultural heritage of people of African descent and the publication Slavery, Resistance, and Abolitions, a Plural Perspective. Systemic racism needs a systemic response, which cannot be done without acknowledging and addressing the linkages between its current manifestations and the lack of accountability and redress for the legacies of enslavement, the transatlantic trade, and colonialism, as well as successive racially discriminatory policies and systems. Indeed, this link between past and present forms and manifestations of racism and racial discrimination was explicitly made in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, adopted by consensus 20 years ago. It was at the Durban World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that states acknowledged that, and I will quote, slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should always have been so, end quote. They agreed on the need to achieve justice for victims of the human rights violations which result from racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Acknowledging this and calling for recognition, justice, and development, the General Assembly established the International Decade for People of African Descent from 2015 to 2024. As the coordinator of the decade, I would like to reiterate my main recommendations: to urgently conclude the establishment of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent and to develop a draft United Nations Declaration on the promotion and full respect of human rights of people of African descent in full collaboration with people of African descent. Colleagues, friends, last year the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis, USA, led to global protests against racism and racial discrimination and prompted important discussions on the legacy of enslavement and colonialism. It also triggered an urgent debate at the Human Rights Council last June and the subsequent adoption of a resolution mandating my office to prepare a comprehensive report on systemic racism, human rights violations against Africans and people of African descent by law enforcement agencies, accountability and redress for victims, and government responses to anti-racism peaceful protests. Just last week, I updated the Human Rights Council on the preparation of my office's report, which will be presented to the Council in June. This year's midterm review of the International Decade for People of African Descent and the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action are important opportunities to revitalize our common actions against racism. And the planned Global Act call against racism can help us in implementing these important frameworks worldwide. In that spirit, I wish you fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.
Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president, of course, and current head of UN Human Rights. Thank you very much for that. An important reminder there of the fact that, of course, these are historical discussions, these are historical problems. They haven't gone away, but of course, the COVID crisis has only increased inequalities and injustices. And of course, the rise of populism, as we've been hearing so far already, has made these issues all the more urgent. Crisis is also opportunity. I'm going to introduce you now to our next speaker, who is the Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo Nguka, who's going to give us her insight into what now needs to be done.
UNESCO, thank you for inviting me to your Global Forum Against Discrimination and Racism. We live in a world where racism and discrimination is well and alive. And we need leaders, such as heads of state, such as leaders of the United Nations, leaders of civil society, leaders of corporations, to actively take a stand and uproot racism. Because if we do not take concrete steps, we allow racism to be entrenched, and this is what makes it systemic. It is normalized and tolerated. We need to be anti-racist, which means we're taking steps and measures to bring about change, to bring remedies to those who need them. Mandela used to say, when good men do nothing for gender equality, that is conspiracy against women. So we don't want to be bystanders and conspire against people of color. We need to take action in our own organizations so that we are a true example for the world. Thank you.
Ms. Mlambo Nguka there, thank you so much for that important message. I'm going to introduce you now to a man who almost needs none. We all know his face, his name. He's going to deliver now the next message, Mr. Forrest Whitaker, who is not only a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador, but also the co-founder of the International Institute for Peace. Have a listen.
We are gathered today for this global forum against racism and discrimination because humanity is in crisis. COVID-19 has directly impacted our personal, social, economic, and cultural lives. But I also think of a deeper, more malign impact of the virus, which has both revealed and worsened some of the darker sides of our societies. The coronavirus pandemic seems to have caused the surge of an old virus, one that lives not in our bodies, but in our minds: racism and discrimination. In many places, racial inequalities and exclusions have been exacerbated, and racial minorities have been disproportionately hit by the virus or increasingly targeted by systemic violence. Gender inequalities have also risen as lockdown measures have resulted in women losing their freedoms and opportunities. And this doesn't even include the rise of violence against women, both in rich and poor countries. This is a disturbing picture, especially because in recent decades, we have seen much progress in the fight against racism and discrimination. This is manifest in the immense work accomplished by the United Nations and UNESCO to disseminate the principles behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the countries of the world. This declaration states that racism and discrimination can never be legitimate or legal. However, good legal frameworks are not enough to transform societies. I am deeply aware of this as an African American citizen of the United States. Time and again, we have seen how legal progress can be stalled by attitudes and practices of racism and discrimination. Growing up in the south central area of Los Angeles in the late 60s and 70s, I saw and experienced racism and discrimination in the form of violent arbitrary arrest, segregated schools, dilapidated streets, and countless other humiliating injustices. Only 8 years ago, I was frisked at a market for no apparent reason. Countries have laws banning racism and discrimination, but institutions don't change overnight. As President Biden said in his inaugural address, a cry for racial justice, some 400 years in the making, moves us. COVID-19 reminded us that any progress on the path of freedom from racism and discrimination will be fragile. This is the crisis that humanity is going through today. We are witnesses to a growing rejection of racism and discrimination throughout the world, But at the same time, we lack tools and opportunities to build proper defenses in the minds of people, which can jeopardize our progress. As UNESCO's Special Envoy for Peace and Reconciliation, I believe that we deeply renew our efforts in the fight against racism and discrimination. We need innovative ideas and programs in the areas of education, culture, communication, information, and the sciences. These domains are vital in opening the minds and hearts of people to ideas of tolerance and solidarity. More importantly, we must engage more with ordinary citizens to give them spaces where they can take initiatives and develop the civic vaccines that will one day save us from the psychological virus of racism and discrimination. This is the most powerful approach. I witness it every day in the results achieved by my foundation, the Whitaker Peace and Development Initiative. We provide young people from conflict-affected areas and places with knowledge and skills for peace that they later apply in their schools, families, and communities. This is where I see our role in creating opportunities for people to transform their societies from the bottom up. Inclusion is the direction. To end racism and discrimination and live together in peace, we must learn to work together at peace. Thank you.
Mr. Forrest Whitaker, thank you so much for that message. I'm going to show you now a video that's going to allow you to see some of the men and women who are behind UNESCO's International Coalition for Inclusive and Sustainable Cities. It was long known as ICAR. It was born in 2004 as a coalition of cities against racism and discrimination. Of course, it's been an important vehicle for UNESCO's fight against racism and discrimination. It includes 500 members worldwide. Have a look.
We all have a responsibility if we want our cities to thrive.
Le racisme et la discrimination se combattent à l'échelle des personnes, au sein même des communautés. Mais ce combat exige un certain savoir-faire et la capacité d'innover pour changer les choses. C'est précisément dans ce domaine que se fait sentir la force de la coalition internationale et des coalitions régionales.
The city of Gwangju has been organizing the World Human Rights Cities Forum since 2011. We are very happy to work with the UNESCO ICA and the UNESCO APCAD together to make the world more inclusive against discrimination and racism. We also want to help to promote more sustainable world in the future.
We affirm our commitment to build cities free of discrimination.
Together, we are more than 600 cities around the world and 158 cities in Europe. We wish to join the UNESCO Developing Roadmap to eradicate racism and discrimination from our world.
Diversity may allow different perspectives to the table, but it's inclusion that allows those perspectives to have a voice in the conversation.
To build stronger multi-stakeholder partnerships against racism and discrimination through ICAR, we need exchange, best practices, and learning from each other to shape diverse and inclusive cities for our future, for all of us.
Keep a constant dialogue between the different actors while adding the priority attention groups and people who have historically been discriminated against.
Building a stronger multi-stakeholder partnership against racism and discrimination means building up, which is to say, putting community at first and at the heart of all that we do as a network.
Atonement, recognition, acknowledgement, and humble listening are the important first keys to beginning to unlock and overcome the legacy of these racist practices.
Rester en constante réflexion pour innover, ce qui nous interpelle pour mutualiser nos expériences réussies, pour mettre à profit la richesse de la diversité culturelle et envie d'instaurer une culture de paix, une culture de vivre ensemble, une culture d'intersolidarité.
Grâce à la coalition internationale, nous pouvons échanger avec d'autres communautés de partout, apprendre de leurs réalisations et faire rayonner les nôtres. La connaissance, la tolérance, le respect et l'ouverture d'esprit sont parmi les plus grandes richesses de l'humanité.
It's necessary to associate the management and development of people as a strategy for creating diversity to achieve efficiencies in public service.
We need to include different perspectives.
We don't have to hesitate to cooperate together. We can win this fight, I'm sure about that, but only together. International organizations, states, civil societies, and city.
This will take time, but it's definitely worth it. ICAR's different perspectives are its strength. Let's use them.
We really need to include younger generations and be creative.
We should not be shy about sharing the projects. We should not underestimate the importance of social media, and we have to support especially the young population to get into contact with each other and realize we're all just human beings.
I look there at ICAR and its important work, and a reminder, of course, that whilst this conversation is happening today in this global forum, it is at a very local level that these conversations need to happen, that the raising of consciousness is important at that level, and that there are things in communities that need actively and urgently to be done. That brings us to the end of today's opening ceremony. It is my great pleasure now to welcome the woman who's behind a great deal of this, in fact, Gabriela Ramos, who is the Director General of Social and Human Sciences sector of UNESCO, and she's going to moderate today's first panel, which is devoted to the question of how policy can be used to translate that fight against racism.